Guys, hello and welcome back to another episode of Mikey Reacts. So, unfortunately for you guys who thought you were here for a reaction video, this is not a reaction video. This is me answering your questions. This is going to be part 2. But because one of the questions that I received was actually quite a lengthy one, which is really good. This is actually going to be just about one topic. So, I got a question here from Deanna Vera Turner. It's a nice name. It's going to be, the question is, so in your earlier question and answer, you mentioned you became interested in America because of history, starting with the Ken Burns Civil War documentary. Cool. I'd like to know basic thoughts on the war, of Lincoln, of anything that you got thinking about America differently. All right, so that is a really, really good question. Before we answer that, I'm going to say if you want to support me, you know exactly how. There's a button, there's a super thanks button down here. Absolutely anything you support me with will be absolutely incredible, and 20% of that will go to a charity. I'll be putting up a poll, most likely today actually, to get your guys' opinions and see where the money's going to go to. So that is that. Welcome back, and let's get answering the questions. So, what made me interested in America? Yeah, so that's what made me interested in America. Basic thoughts of the war. I think people like to think of it as very much black and white. It was like good versus evil. I think as well, if you're from the South itself, you're naturally going to disagree with that. So people from the North, especially, will say that it was a war fought over slavery. I mean, and obviously those from the South will say states' rights. And honestly, I'm on the fence on this one, because the reality of it is, oh, now my light's just turned off. Let me turn this back on. So there, that's better, I think. So the reality of it is that it was actually like a bit of both, right? In my opinion. So my opinion was, it was about states' rights, but it was also, to a certain extent, states' rights to basically govern themselves and therefore to have slaves. Now, I think what happened is it was, you know, when obviously the North invaded the South, when they got there, I personally, if I was a Southerner who didn't have slaves and wasn't necessarily for slavery or against slavery, I probably would have fought too, because, you know, at that time that you considered yourselves the South, two separate countries from the North. So in fact, it was an invasion of what was sovereign territory. So yeah, fair enough. I mean, if you think, if they, you know, they seceded from the Union, these states, so and there were no laws at the time that prevented secession from the Union. So theoretically speaking, this is not a moral argument for slavery. But if they were genuinely a nation governed by themselves, and they were completely independent, supposedly, from the North, then the North technically had no right to impose any of their laws that were anti-slavery on the South. If you think of it that way, it wasn't technically a civil war, it was a civil war between two sovereign nations. Because the South did have a president, what was his name? Oh my God. It was Jefferson something, no? Maybe so. So that's one perspective for looking at it. My perspective is simply that it was America's most tragic war, because most people don't consider this, but in no other war in history have all the percentage of all the people who died been Americans, as was in the American Civil War, although a lot were Irish immigrants, German immigrants and such and so on, which is actually a very interesting talking point, because there's many amazing Irish and / American folk songs, like the Irish Volunteer, and obviously McClellan, who was the general of the Union Army before Ulysses S. Grant was Irish himself, and he was an appalling general. Well, not appalling necessarily, but he liked to play the slow game. He didn't really like to progress and move forward. So he was obviously fired for that. And then Ulysses S. Grant, obviously, he got a bad rap for being an alcoholic and also being decisive, but somehow making the wrong decisions as well. Someone that we don't seem to have many negative things to say, unless you're a Southerner, is Sherman, apart from the fact that he was extremely brutal, burning down towns in Georgia. So when you hear the devil went down to Georgia, it might not just be referring to the devil himself, right? But my thoughts on it, yeah, it was America's most tragic war. It was brother against brother, father against son, you know. And I think without it, there wouldn't have been true unity in the country. I think there would have been a resentment. I mean, there still was a resentment afterwards, especially with the period of Reconstruction. There was great resentment, and that's where you got figures like Jesse James. Jesse James was, he wasn't necessarily robbing northern trains and banks of the United States because he wanted to be rich. He was through and through a rebel, and he didn't like the Union. Reconstruction really got to him, so he did what he did. So it was tragic, especially when you consider the method that the warfare was fought. You know, back then it was muskets, and you literally stood 100 feet away from the other line. There were charges, of course, but also like you're trading off shots. It's purely a game of chance, and very little of that would have been skill, and that's something that terrifies me as well. I mean, war is a game of chance, always, but especially with modern warfare now, that there's an element of skill that comes into it, or strength. You know, how fast can you run, how your tactics. But back then, it wasn't really. Tactics won battles, but it didn't save lives. So that was something tragic about it. And when you look at the medical care that they received as well, it was extremely rudimentary because of the time. So if you got shot in the leg, it was an amputation. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't anything that could be done. And obviously there was no true painkiller and no morphine and such. So again, a very brutal war. The socioeconomic consequences of it, I mean, of course, the South became much poorer afterwards, and the North was always wealthier because of it had, you know, the industrial might, and the South was more rural. So those are my thoughts on it. I mean, I can go into more detail. I think there's nothing. I don't think there's anything wrong with waving the Confederate flag now. I think flags can change in their meanings, of course, bar the Nazi flag, that will always mean the same thing. But I don't think the Confederate flag was ever a call to arms for racists. I think it was a matter of Southern pride. So I think by waving the Confederate flag now, it may be a slight disrespect to the Union, which obviously encompasses all of the contiguous United States and of course Alaska and Hawaii, but I don't think it has racist connotations. And there are many people who think the same way I do. I think they just want to ban the Confederate flag because it offends them, but it's just a banner, and it's a banner of pride. Let people have their heritage. And then especially now when you come to bringing down statues, I mean, you know, Robert E. Lee was a general in the Union Army before he led the Confederates. He was as American as they come. I mean, of course, you know, Arlington is on his land, not obviously the state's land now, but was his land. And the life of Robert E. Lee after the war was, you know, as it would be. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I think the South shouldn't have shame. I think it was a war fought. I mean, there's a very, very famous quote when a when a Confederate prisoner was asked, "Man, you don't have slaves. Why are you fighting?" And he goes, "Because you're here." So they were fighting because they were there. And any of us would do that, right? No matter our values or whatsoever. I don't agree with some of the values the United Kingdom has whatsoever. But if France started invading, of course I'd pick up a rifle. Of course. Damn right. I think anyone would. So yeah, that's my opinion on that, to be quite honest, you know. So anything that got, and then my opinion of Lincoln. Honest Abe, you know, the one interesting thing about Lincoln that's overlooked now, especially by Democrats and people who argue over politics, is that Lincoln was not was not a racist. I'm not saying he's a racist, but I believe his values towards his beliefs towards people of color, or people that weren't Caucasian, were demonstrative of the 1860s. He obviously did think them less of him, 100%. I'm not calling him a bad person. I'm just saying that was the general consensus. He didn't think they should be enslaved. Okay, but I personally don't think a war would have started if there hadn't been secession. I think the war was more about bringing the southern states back into the Union than it was about slavery for Lincoln. That's my opinion. I don't think it was much to do with slavery. I think the abolition of slavery was a byproduct of the war, yes, but I don't think the war was about slavery. I think that Lincoln fought the war to create a unified United States as opposed to the Union and the Confederacy. That's my opinion. I think it was more of a strategic war as opposed to a moral one. I think he was a good man. He was a smart man. He was a lawyer, or at least he was trained in the law. So I believe he was a lawyer. And of course, his assassination was tragic. It's not to know what would have happened if the assassination didn't occur with the little Derringer, But yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm quite ignorant on Lincoln. I think for me, I know Lincoln only in the context of the Civil War. I don't really know anything much about his personal life. I know his wife was Mary Todd, I believe. And aside from that, nothing. So if you guys know anything, let me know down in the comments if there's anything I should know about Lincoln. I think one thing that's overlooked is that it was the Republican Party that abolished slavery. Look, that's just a historical fact. That's the case. And did it get me thinking about America differently? Yes. I used to think of the United States simply as the United States, but the documentary of the Civil War and learning the history of everything that happened afterwards actually makes me appreciate the genuine differences between the North and the South. There's a cultural difference. There's a passionate difference. Still the North is more industrial, and still the South is more agricultural. And I think that there's two very different ways of life. And I suppose if you lean towards one or the other, then either the South or the North is going to be more beneficial to you. Of course, now it's not just the South and the North that exist. You have the West Coast and the Midwest and stuff like that. So that obviously is a difference. But yeah, I didn't start thinking any less or any more of anyone necessarily. I see myself as someone who maybe not the Southern values back then, but who can resonate more with Southern values now. Like I don't. If anyone here is from New York, and I apologize, but New York isn't somewhere that I see myself living. Maybe upstate New York, but I wouldn't see myself living in the city. The same thing as Chicago. That isn't somewhere that I would really look at. For me, when I think of where would I move to the United States, I think of Texas, Florida, Alabama. I think of more rural places with smaller towns, and that's just my thing. I grew up in a rural place in a small town. I'm actually back home now in the UK. You can see my background has changed. So yeah, I resonate more with that way of life and the people and with being around animals. For example, actually, in fact, right over there, just across the road, I don't have neighbors, I have cows. So you can see why, that's just how I was raised, and I think that's why I resonate more with the South. Guys, that was my answer, my 14-minute answer to one question. So if you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate a subscription and a like and a thumbs up. Hit the notification bell, and if you really want to support the channel, you know exactly how, but a subscription is more than enough. Guys, thank you so much for watching. As you know, I'm gonna be back with some more reaction videos tomorrow. Today's a light day. I've got a formal event this evening, so I'm gonna get nice and suited up and I'll be going out to that. So starting tomorrow, I'll make you 3 nice reaction videos tomorrow. I know I've been very busy. I've been on 2 or 3 flights over the last 4 days. It's been a difficult, busy kind of time for me with sleep and time changes and stuff. I'm no longer in the Middle East. I'll be in the UK for the next 3 days, and then I'm going back to the Middle East. So yeah, but yeah, I will be back tomorrow with some reaction videos from your recommendations. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'll see you soon.